Greetings as we come to the 17th Sunday of the year and of this what we call the B year. And the readings are the first reading from the second book of Kings, chapter 4, verses 42 to 44, from the letter attributed to Paul to the Ephesians, again chapter 4, verses 1 through 6, and the gospel this time is from the Gospel according to John, chapter 6, beginning with verse 1 and running through verse 15. Now you will remember, as we've mentioned on a number of occasions, that the gospel guide of this year is Mark, but that it tends to be a rather short gospel, and so to find selections for each of the Sundays of ordinary time turn out to be somewhat difficult. And so we enter today, this time, with the first of 5 weeks dedicated to the 6th chapter of John's Gospel. Well, I say we will hear 4 selections. There are really 5 weeks, but one of them this time, the 15th of August, will fall on the Feast of the Assumption of Our Lady, and so that will replace the ordinary Sunday of that time. John's Gospel, as you remember, was the last of the 4 Gospels to be written, and there's a kind of connection, or interesting connection, when one remembers that the Gospel tradition according to Mark was the first written, probably somewhere around the year 70, and the Gospel of John somewhere between the year 90 and 120, although the ordinary kind of consensus would be the last decade of the first century, so that would be sometime in the 90s. But if one thinks about it, the Gospel of John, and we have mentioned some of these things at other times because, as we noticed throughout important dates of the calendar of our liturgical year, sections from John's Gospel are being used. The 6th chapter of John's Gospel gets considerable ink and attention because it is often known as the Eucharistic chapter. It is the longest single chapter in John's Gospel, some 70 verses, in that it presents a complete sequence. Now, remember that last week we discussed a little bit the fact that when Jesus had been taking the disciples aside for a little rest, that they had been approached by a number of people who followed them, and that at that point Jesus had been concerned about the health of those who had come with him, and it was the disciples who had said to Jesus, "You know, it's getting to be supper time, and let's send them home so that they can get something to eat." Now, we discussed last time Mark's take on this famous feeding story. As I mentioned last occasion, this story is told 6 times, twice by Mark and Matthew, and once by Luke and John. So today we are going to be listening to John's version. So rather than publicly, remember I mentioned last time, we did not hear from the Sunday reading Mark's approach to the feeding, but this time we're going to get John's. Now, there are all kinds of reasons perhaps why this decision was made by the liturgist. It's important, and I remind us that what we're looking at here in these discussions, is the scriptural narration and its purpose and meaning. This does not always gel or coincide with the way in which it is presented for our Sunday listening and for our homilies on the Sunday Scripture. So although this is often called the Eucharistic chapter of John's Gospel, that is true. but perhaps it's important to put the whole of this chapter, of the gospel, into perspective. So I mention all of this because sometimes by taking certain sections out of this chapter and leaving out others, you do create a kind of possible message that doesn't exactly fit the way in which the original work had intention. So, how does this begin? And always remember, we are looking at the thinking of the Johannine tradition. What has preceded this 6th chapter of John? Well, one goes back to notice that you had the fact that he was the Word. And this is key. This is key to appreciating the 4th gospel, that Jesus is indeed the Word. Now, he is the Word of God, but Word also, of course, has the understanding of teaching, of giving a message. But Jesus himself in this gospel is the message. He is the Word of God. So as you probably know and remember, that often terms used in the 4th gospel have layers of meaning, not simply one way of interpreting it or understanding it, but possible others. And this is what makes this gospel so often interpreted by so many thinkers and reflectors throughout the 2,000 years of our Christian tradition. It begins by picturing Jesus as teaching on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, or in this gospel also called the Sea of Tiberias. We've mentioned before that in Jesus' own lifetime, he probably had little to do with this particular place, because, and therefore the name, the Sea of Tiberias, is really more correct. It was a city that, if you remember, had been developed by the then leader of the community for the Jews, namely Herod Antipas, not Herod the Great, but Herod his son, and wanting a little bit to get favor with Rome, decided that he would create a kind of resort city or village, whatever it turned out to be, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, but now call it the Sea of Tiberias. After all, who was the emperor but Tiberius, and what better way to honor him than to name a city after him? See, so all of this, think about it now, some 60 years after Jesus' time, as this gospel is being written, would have been familiar. And that's something to the listener of this gospel, and that's something to keep in mind. We sometimes need to back up and explain things, put them into perspective. For the contemporaries of this gospel writer, they would have been well known and did not need a great deal of explanation. So it is there on the shores of the Sea of Tiberias that Jesus is pictured as teaching. Now, this is an important image in John's gospel, for he is pictured very often as the teacher, the word teacher. Notice that important connection between this imagery. And if Jesus' words are teachings, then that's how this gospel pictures much of what Jesus does. Now, there is a certain characteristic that this gospel uses. It is that the gospel writer uses what are called signs. And in fact, in this gospel, Jesus performs 7 great signs, as you'll remember. And the opening section of the 4th gospel is known as the Book of Signs. Now, it works this way, though, that Jesus will be pictured as a great teacher. But before he begins the teaching, there is usually some action, often a miracle, that precedes the teaching that Jesus gives, so that the sign is visibly an action, and then the sign is the words or the teaching that Jesus gives. That's how chapter 6 begins. What is the sign? Well, as Jesus is teaching on the shores of the sea to a great number of people, we will see that a traditional number that was used by the other evangelists is also used here, 5,000. That as they are coming toward the end of the teaching, Jesus will inaugurate a dialogue with two of his disciples. Now, also the gospel writer points out that this occasion takes place during the time of the Jewish celebration of Passover. Now, as we know, Passover was celebrated in the spring of the year, and technically, Passover was to be celebrated in Jerusalem, that many of the Jews went up at this time of the year, up to Jerusalem for a celebration of the Passover. So why does John mention that the Passover was near, and here is Jesus teaching at the time of the Passover in the Galilee? Well, now here's an interesting kind of observation that we have, that sometimes teachers, being present in Jerusalem, where of course the offering was a lamb, remember that there was special offerings that were made at the time of the Passover lamb, all of that. But there was also a custom that someone who was in Jerusalem for this celebration could, within a month's time, celebrate in the context of the Passover again. It was known as the second Passover. And that seems to be what's going on in this little part of John's Gospel, that Jesus here will be celebrating an event that has loads of Old Testament background to it, with those who are gathered for his teaching. So all of that, a little bit, as I mentioned, you will not hear a lot of this when come the weekend, because perhaps it's not necessary, but to appreciate really what is going on in this chapter, I do suggest that some of this background might be helpful. So it's going now toward evening time, and Jesus inaugurates, as I mentioned, a dialogue with Philip and Andrew. Now you remember in the tradition last week of Mark that they asked Jesus, look, Jesus, it's getting dark. Why don't we send them out so that they can get something to eat? That's not the way it works here. Here, Jesus says to Philip, how are we going to take care of feeding all these people? So the inauguration of the problem of helping people who are hungry comes not from the disciples, but comes from Jesus. And Philip says, well, you know, how are we possibly going to take care of all these people with the limited resources that we have? It's just not something that we can do. So you see, this opening dialogue about taking care of the folks is made by Jesus. He's the first. Then there is also Andrew. Now it is Andrew who comes up to Jesus. He must have been, or maybe the two of them were standing there together, we really don't know, and says to Jesus, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Now you may not pay any attention to the fact that the mention is made of barley loaves. Barley bread, barley grain, was I won't say the least expensive, but it was generally the kind of grain that was used by the poor. In fact, when you went up to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover, you would not use barley loaves. But, as I mentioned, since this is in the Galilee, this is with ordinary people, the very mention of barley is important. There were 3 grains, as you know, rye, wheat, and barley. The first 2 were the more regular, more expensive, used for kind of baking and making loaves. But for the poor, barley. So there's a lot, see, at work here that's going on in this Gospel of John. Well, the question, what are we going to do with 5 little loaves? And even the fact they were barley loaves might suggest that they were smaller than some of the bigger loaves that could be made with wheat and rye. So you see, all of it kind of works together in an interesting way. Now, Jesus had been teaching what? At this point, we're not sure what he was teaching or what the nature of his teaching was. But he had apparently enthralled the group who were there, and so they were being very attentive to what he had to say. Jesus now tells his disciples to have everyone sit down. Again, one needs to keep in mind that this idea of feeding hungry people who were in great need at times has overtones from the great story of deliberation, which was connected with the Passover. Remember, what does the Passover remember? The fact that God had passed over the homes of the Israelite people. They had been set free by the Pharaoh. They had escaped out of Egypt, crossed through the waters of the sea, and were now in the desert. How had God taken care of the people? One might remember, and I'm sure you're a little bit familiar with the story of the Exodus, which is found in the 2nd book of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Begin to grumble. The Israelites are, and we've got to be careful here, but they were pretty ordinary. They began to grumble that as they are wandering now in the wilderness, yeah, God has helped them, but they're hungry. And they say to Moses, here we are, perhaps exaggerating a little bit, we never do that, but here we are starving to death out here in the wilderness, while back in Egypt we had leeks and all kinds of food to eat, and maybe, although we were slaves, we also had sufficient food. It's at this point that God provides, remember, what is known as manna, and this is called the bread from heaven. Now, what is John going to say? That the bread from heaven came from God, not from Moses, but Moses, of course, had been the one that had to deal with his grumbling fellow Israelites, and that the manna had come out into the wilderness in the morning. Remember, they were told, gather up as much as you need for the day. Don't take any more than what you can eat. Don't think that you can save it. And so the Israelites experienced manna every day, but always fresh, because if they tried to get more, save it, put it in the bread box, didn't work, it melted away, okay? So the manna was the bread of heaven. Now what is John going to say? The bread of heaven is none other than Jesus. So keep in mind that we're setting up here a very important connection with the Hebrew Bible, which this gospel, by the way, more than more uses. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our talk today, the ordinary folk who heard this gospel made these connections without their having to be explained, you see, because most likely the audience who reads John's gospel were members of the Hebraic community. So they knew the stories, they knew the message that had come. So Jesus has them sit down, and then Jesus, and this is maybe some differences between now the way in which Mark tells the story and the way in which John tells the story. As I mentioned, in the synoptics, the initiative is taken by the disciples. In John's gospel, the initiative is taken by Jesus, with that rhetorical question to Philip, how are we going to feed all of these? In the synoptic tradition, Jesus takes the loaves, blesses them and gives them to the disciples, who then give them to the gathered people. In this gospel, it is Jesus himself who takes the loaves and feeds the people. 5 loaves. Now you may say, well, isn't that an interesting number of loaves? If you're a little bit Jewish, you get there's something else at work here. 5. 5 was an important number because it represented the 5 books of the law, or the Torah, which are the opening 5 books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. So even the fact that Jesus, the teacher, and of course, who was the great teacher but Moses? And so Jesus, and this is an important theme, among others, that runs through the 4th gospel, is a replacement. Very often Jesus does things that replace something that happened in the Old Testament. It isn't that he does away with it, but that, I suppose we would say, brings it to a greater level, to a deeper sense, okay? So we will find that Jesus replaces the law, because who is the new law, the Torah, but Jesus himself? Now, what had Moses engineered? God bringing the manna that nourished. Later on, we will see, and this becomes part over the next couple weeks as we look at John's story, Jesus himself replaces the manna, is the bread. See, so what I'm suggesting today a little bit is familiarity with Jewish customs and Jewish beliefs is helpful in appreciating the story that John tells, particularly here in the 6th chapter. Now, one of the things that, just to finish up John's approach here, everyone gets enough to eat, everyone is satisfied, and in fact, there is bread left over. We really don't know a whole lot about what happens to the fish. Now, what's the substitute here? The substitute is the bread for the lamb. Remember, in the Passover meal, it is the lamb that is offered up and eaten. Here, it will be the bread, a different kind of bread that will be eaten and shared. And so again, a replacement from something that was to something now that will be. In the book of Exodus, and later on this same story is told. What's the story? The story of feeding the multitude in the wilderness is told in the book of Deuteronomy, which is the 5th book of the Torah. And in chapter 18, verse 15 of that book, Moses is pictured as saying, "I will raise up a prophet like Moses." So now, you see, here's another one of those fulfillment kind of episodes where the one who is raised up is none other than Jesus, a prophet like Moses. But if Moses was great, and here, of course, is the emphasis that John's gospel makes, Jesus is greater. So you see, in this gospel, there's a lot to be looked at. And then there's also a line that says, "Nothing will perish of this new bread." So it is put into 12 baskets. Well, now, what does 12 mean? Well, we've seen this earlier on. Completion. But unlike the manna, which wilted away if it was, kind of gathered up, the bread that Jesus provides, or is, does not melt away, but saves and stays. And so what the gospel is saying at this point is that there is the arrival of something new, of something better. So that explains a little bit how John presents this feeding. And it's the setup, and we will see as we come next time, we will see how he develops now an understanding of Jesus, the Word, but also the bread. Now, just a quick look at the opening reading. The opening reading comes from the book of Kings and is a story connected with one of the two great prophets of that book, this one, Elisha. And Elisha is in the land of Israel at a time in which there is a famine. And the story is, precedes just a little bit the section we will hear this week, precedes the fact that Elisha had made a kind of food mixture and thrown into the pot as the ingredients were being made, something which caused them to go bad. Now, and of course, what kind of bread were they baking? Barley loaves. So what happens here is that the prophet, of course, the spokesperson for God, redoes it, throws in some new stuff, and the bread turns out to be wonderful. Now, the story that we hear is that Elisha is approached by some of the priests of that area or prophets of that area. Apparently Elisha is connected. I think we mentioned a couple of talks before that there were what were known as groups of prophets. And Elisha now has become one of those. And they come to Elisha and say, we got 100 guys here who are hungry. Oh, and how many loaves of barley bread do we have? 20. Oh. Now, so you begin to see a little bit of a connection here that Elisha now, however that happens, feeds the 100 hungry prophets with the 20 loaves of bread. And not only does he feed them, but there are some loaves left over. That is, barley loaves left over. So Elisha is motivated here by generosity. And he realizes that he has been the recipient of great gift from God, and that it's important for him to share that gift with those who are hungry. So very nicely, this particular choice, I think, from the second book of Kings, mirrors what goes on in the gospel. And you can smile and see, if Elisha can feed 100 priests or prophets with 20 loaves of bread, Jesus can feed 5,000 with 5 loaves of bread. Anything Elisha can do, Jesus can do better. So you see, again, he doesn't do away with the generosity of Elisha, who recognizes that these loaves were a gift from God and he shares them, but puts Jesus in the position of a new Elisha, a new prophet. And that, of course, is another image that is not too much developed by John's gospel, but is certainly part of the gospel tradition. So just as everybody in Elisha's time had enough to eat and even had left over, in John's story here, there's enough to eat and there are enough leftovers. So this is the inaugurative sign in chapter 6 that will give rise now to an interesting discussion or dialogue, if you want, on the part of Jesus as to the meaning of this sign, of this feeding. And if you want to we'll go into this a little bit further, so you'll have to come back next time to see how this begins to unfold. Thank you for being with us, and see you soon.